Hello and welcome to the NCSS C3 Collaborative Literacy Professional Development Webinar, Meeting the Common Core for ELA Part 2, Reading Informational Text. This webinar, along with others in our series, are part of the College, Career, and Civic Life Framework for Social Studies State Standards Literacy Collaborative, C3LC, which NCSS is implementing in collaboration with the National Center for Literacy and Education and which is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. My name is Anna Post, and I'm the Director of External Relations and Council Communications at NCSS, as well as this grant's project coordinator. The goal of this initiative is to create and operationalize a plan designed specifically for social studies teachers to implement the Common Core State Standards for English Language Arts by utilizing the C3 framework. This webinar is produced in conjunction with an in-depth investigation that can be accessed by the C3LC project teacher groups at the Literacy and Learning Exchange site. Non-project participants will also be able to access the project activities and learning modules at the Exchange site or at the NCSS C3LC webpage. Links to these web locations will be provided at the end of the webinar. Let me now turn over the microphone to Dr. Tina Hefner, who will introduce herself and her colleague, Dr. Dixie Massey.
Hi, and welcome. I see some familiar faces in the audience. This is Tina Hefner speaking. I'm a professor at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and I am so excited to introduce to you a colleague that I've been working with for close to 15 years now, Dr. Dixie Massey, who is at the University of Washington. And Dixie and I have co-authored several books together, Targeted Vocabulary Instruction and Secondary Social Studies, Strategic Reading Series in World History and U.S. History, Seeds of Inquiry in U.S. History, and we have a forthcoming book, which is using short text in World History. Dixie and I have formed a partnership partly because of the unique expertise that I think the two of us bring to the table, and I think you're going to see evidence of that in this particular session. Our objective for our session today is to bring C3 framework literacy and integrated Common Core literacies as well into our social studies classrooms. And we're going to showcase for you and model for you some ways in which we do this with both visual and informational text. We made here for you a few C3 connections. If you were with me last week, I went through a formal overview of the integration of C3 literacies and Common Core literacies and how both serve a common interest. But we're also going to take that a little bit further, where I indicated that there are some differences of how C3 literacies expand and build upon the Common Core foundational literacies to look at more disciplinary ways in which we engage with text. Disciplinary questioning of text. We're going to also model for you how we use inquiry as a way to engage students to want to choose to enter into text when they're reading. We'll also model for you questions that guide our thinking, disciplinary specific types of questions, the ways we use evidence from text to make informed inferences, evaluating and critiquing and questioning the text and the evidence that's within the text, looking across text, corroborating evidence across those. We'll also be examining how we communicate conclusions through our active reading, talking, and writing exercises. And all of these fall under the umbrella of literacies that are part of the inquiry arc instructional dimensions, the 4 dimensions on developing questions, planning inquiries, applying disciplinary tools and concepts, evaluating sources and using evidence, and communicating conclusions and taking informed action. So I am going to turn the mic over to my colleague, Dixie Massey, and she is going to model some of these literacies that I just mentioned.
Thank you, Tina. Let me also add my welcome to everybody. And just to reiterate, we're going to invite you to join us on a brief inquiry. This is a model of what we've done with students, and our goal is historical inquiry. But to support that goal, we have some very specific ways that we use text, and we define text very broadly to include images as well. And we use those to scaffold readers, including struggling readers and English language learners. Right now, what you're seeing is 3 images. in a minute, we're going to show you these images again. So we're going to come back to them. Let me clarify what we're going to ask you to do first. So in the next slide, we're going to see noticing and wondering. You aren't going to have this exact chart, but we are going to ask you to first notice, and that those noticings are just what do you observe in the images that you're seeing. And then we're going to ask that you hold and not try and jump to, I know exactly what these images are. If you do know what those images are, we're going to ask you to take a step back and do the observations of just listing what do you see in those images. And then the wondering column is for things that you still have additional questions for. So when we do this, we use the I wonder as a question stem to help students get started. And we might give them a sample question. I wonder what, and that's the place where we're going to ask you to do some questioning. Now you'll want to try and notice and wonder for each of the three images. So not all as one kind of group, but when you're doing this, as you see image 1, you'll want to do some specific noticing for that and then some wondering for that as well. So we're going to take you back to those images now, and we're going to give you, let me specify which one is which. So image 1, we're going to refer to that as the image that's the larger size. It's the one that's on the left, and then we'll go in a clockwise manner. So the one that is on the top right hand corner is going to be image 2, and the bottom right image is image 3. As you notice and wonder, go ahead and share in the chat boxes that are going to come out what you're noticing, and we'll share that as a group. Let me give you just a few minutes to respond to those images then.
Right, so I'm seeing some answers appearing, and I like the way that you're identifying those so we can make the distinction of what noticings are connected to each image. So image 1 appears to have been holding something. Another observation about image 1 is a skeleton of a human. Right, image 2, there seems to be a weapon with number 2. Okay, another observation about image 1, it seems to have pretty long legs. Image 2 seems to have a bar around the neck. Image 2, wondering about the piece that looks like metal near the neck.
So excellent job thinking about what you're seeing in these images. Can we go ahead and then start to shift to wondering based on those things that you have listed in your noticing? What then is left that we don't understand yet and we may need some more information about? So you're thinking about where these images were found, how these people died, if these three humans had the same living situation. Some excellent questions that you're asking in those wonderings. So we're going to go ahead and put that wondering and noticing on pause for just a little bit, and let's go back to thinking about, as we're planning instruction for our students, then we're talking about inquiry. And inquiry often begins with compelling questions. Now, when we came up with this inquiry, Tina and I started with a compelling question. And this isn't a step that we would always do with our students next. It would depend on their background and their comfort. But instead of just moving right into an answer of how these images are related, what we're going to ask you to do, based on the things that you've noticed and based on the things that you're wondering, is to come up with a quick draft of your own compelling question. Remember, a compelling question should be a broad question that leads to further inquiry and exploration of multiple perspectives and allows for not just a single right answer. So asking you to come up with your own compelling question is a bit of a departure from what we normally think of in terms of sequencing student learning, and we're going to explain why we made that choice in just a little bit. So we should see a text box coming up here that asks you to share with us your own compelling question from your wonderings.
Right, so some examples of compelling questions I see are, how do you think these people died? What does death tell us about how people live? How do people justify taking the life of other people? Why did they choose skeletons from 3 places?
Those are excellent questions. Ones that I would like to explore some more in depth. And part of the reason that we do that is sometimes as teachers, we come up with particular compelling questions and we go down a particular path when our students may have a path already in mind. If they can demonstrate some places that they might like to go to answer those questions in more detail, some evidence that they would need, then maybe there's a possibility that we can allow them to explore some of their own questions and link those to their motivation. Now, in this particular instance, and for the purposes of this webinar, we have settled on a single question to guide the rest of our inquiry. But the questions that you all came up with are perfect examples of, we might let students kind of do a self-exploration and inquiry of what they're doing and ask them particularly about what sources they might use to do that. So part of this is a way to scaffold students who may be more adept at this and who need a little bit more support. So for what Tina and I came up with, our compelling question was, what can you infer about how these people died and what evidence supports that inference? Once we offer our compelling question, we've established a particular path for the rest of the inquiry, and the students may definitely need that. You may need to do that in order to meet particular standards and goals. The alternative that I already mentioned is to ask the students to come up with a compelling question. This allows us to capitalize on their interests and motivation and helps develop some self-regulatory habits. That is, do they know where to go next and how to answer the questions instead of always relying on a teacher to say, here's where to go, read this source, and find the answer. So Tina, will you talk us through the use of images next as an entry task before we get to an exploration of some more information about those images?
Certainly. We call what we use, the exercise that we did at the very beginning, a visual inventory, partly because it is a visual sensory experience that brings multiple different types of learners into the conversation and creates more of an equitable opportunity for students to engage in inquiry from the onset. We in particular like to use visual images with English language learners. We also use images with struggling readers or reluctant readers, but images are also powerful tools for use with all types of learners. Our purpose in using visual inventory is again to establish this foundational interest and to generate and sustain inquiry by having students develop some of the questioning on their own. So we're building foundational inquiry and disciplinary literacies too. Our goal is to practice historical thinking by asking and generating questions, and those questions guide our interest to make content again more accessible, as I already indicated, with all creating this equitable opportunity for inquiry, to allow students to begin to make some connections, to bring forth some of the schema that they already have in place, that they may be making some connections with. And also that schema comes into play as they move forward in their inquiry process, as we move into additional sources. We want them to, as Jerry Breford calls it, to anchor our thinking, to anchor our schema, what we're learning with what we already know, and making interesting and meaningful connections. We also are trying to help develop questions. This is a generative and iterative process, and we're trying to make sure that they understand that inquiry isn't by us offering the question from the onset. We're inspiring students to begin to ask their own questions. And our goal again is to initiate inquiry. And we haven't gotten into the steps, but a nice progression of where we would go next. And this is where Dixie indicated that we developed a compelling question to guide us as we go forth, but each of you could have moved from your compelling questions into planning your inquiry, which is a skill that C3 expects of our students. We also use visual inventory as a way to support students that struggle. What is it that keeps students engaged, that helps them to hold on to their questions, to make them want to go and to deepen those questions, to develop them at a different level? When gaps sometimes exist in students' content knowledge, and let's say maybe your students weren't inspired by the 3 images we showed, or perhaps they aren't developing the types of questions that would lead to compelling questions that would lead to an inquiry. And students are struggling. Maybe they don't have the existing schema. They don't have those content anchors to connect to. And they're not making connections across images, or perhaps they're not interpreting evidence to support their inferences as we would want. We offer a video as a way, another tool, additional layer to scaffold the development of inquiry and visual interest, and to initiate and building those connections and initiating inquiries. We're actually not going to show this video. We do provide this as a resource for you of, if you still have students struggle, this would be an added layer that we would position for our students.
So images allow equal access to content and levels the learning opportunities for struggling readers, English language learners, children with exceptionalities, and students who are able but unmotivated readers. And I just want to mention that this is not just a historical practice, but it's a good literacy practice as well. It allows us to introduce vocabulary, to give access to complex texts by previewing texts, and to build conceptual and background knowledge, to anchor concepts or terms to content knowledge and invite students to think in response to their wonderings, and to engage with the text. So we suggest that the images are helpful for generating and engaging in the thinking rather than just providing the concrete answers. With the 3 images we offered to you, we might next offer you a text that answers the single question, the compelling question of how these people died. But we want to deepen the questions just a little bit and help students evaluate and question sources and hopefully continue to engage with the text. So with that in mind, we're going to provide a literary text excerpt as the next reading. So specifically, we're going to look at a text by Marcus Sedgwick, and this is an excerpt. And as we read this, we're going to read to figure out the possibility for how this author, and remember this is a literary fiction account, of how these three images might be connected. And then additionally, we're going to highlight or underline the ways that Sedgwick's account differs from the images. Any questions that come to mind as you're reading, you're welcome to drop those into the chat box so we can all learn from those too. So just one more quick overview on the slides. If we can look at the next one, this is taken from Midwinterblood. It's by Marcus Sedgwick. Just as an aside, this is part of a much larger work that he was inspired to write from a single painting. So again, we're still exploring what can we infer about how these people died. Let me give you now a few minutes to read and then think about this literary text where Marcus Sedgwick offers one possibility for how the three images that you saw initially were linked. And now you should be able to see the text box about, based on this reading, what can you infer about how these people died? And then what would your evidence be from this text?
As you think about evidence from the text, you can also think about how evidence is corroborated within the text that might connect or question or challenge information that existed that you identified as evidence from your images. So here you would, while we can't show you necessarily at this point within our webinar, but imagine having your layers of text or visual and text evidence and mapping those over each other.
So some responses, we're seeing these people didn't die of natural causes. They were killed by other humans. People thought they were vampires. They were killed with mythological vampire killing techniques. Stakes were hammered into the corpse. They seemed to re-kill the person in the grave to ensure he was dead. And when I've used this text with readers, I have sometimes used the longer excerpt that sort of builds to this. I've shown the images first and then used a longer text excerpt that's not immediately apparent, but sort of leads the reader to the conclusion that maybe they thought that Tor was a vampire, but it wasn't logical right away from the beginning. We only gave you the excerpt where that actually happened in here. So we're going to go ahead and look at the next slide now. And at this point now, what we've tried to do is buy some engagement from students, some wondering, was this literary text, is that actually accurate? Did people really think that, or did Marcus Sedgwick just make that up? And so next we're ready to take students now to a nonfiction text. This is a short text again. And as we're looking at this, we kind of ask the question, vampires? So we're going to verify from this next excerpt that you're about to read how the images are related, and we can again direct students to highlight that evidence. Were any of our wonderings answered? So in a classroom, it's great to list those questions and leave them up in the classroom so that we can come back to those and see if we're answering any of those questions. And then, do we have new questions that we want to add? So again, our compelling question is, what can you infer about how these people died? And we're going to show you the next reading that's a nonfiction account. So in this text, seems to corroborate the fiction text in that these were believed to be vampires, and that archaeologists find various evidence as they uncover these graves that makes them think that the person that was buried in that grave was believed at the time to be a vampire. So we need to look now and see, is this common, and what does another source say? So we're getting ready to now lead students into an additional source. Depending on where students are with both their engagement and their understanding, we might want to take time to explore more about the questions that we have possibly answered at this point, or the additional questions that they have. But for this webinar, we're going to go ahead and go to this next source. And Tina's going to talk just a little bit before then about why we use a series of short texts and what short texts allow us to do to explore.
It's very important that we expose all students to informational text and to complex text. But diving into a complex text immediately does not assure that students are going to have success. So it's very important that we scaffold their ability to engage in the contents, build their schema, build their content knowledge, their background knowledge as they move into more complex text. So we use a layered process as Dixie has modeled for you, from our visual text to our fictional text to our informational text, and we're not finished. It's where do we go to next as we move into more complex text. But we've used short text in particular to, one, make content more accessible for all students. We use short text in a series as we've begun here. We also bring reluctant readers into the content through short text. Short texts are easy to manage, not to mention that you have the capacity, and we haven't done this, but you can do close readings with short text to allow you to go back and reread, to exercise some important foundational literacy skills that close reading can teach students. We also have the capacity to build and generate interest, and then interest becomes this iterative and generative process in which we're using text to make students wonder, to ask questions. We are also helping them begin to develop their own abilities to ask questions, and the questions emerge as they gain more information from text. And you know, if you use an exceptionally long text, and ultimately we do want to engage students and build their reading stamina over time, if we do that too early, then we develop disengaged students, and we also are not supporting students to actually develop their reading. The more they read, the better. And we want them to read informational text. And this is where we're using short text in this manner to promote and jumpstart inquiry, but also to make content accessible to all students, and to scaffold and to build their reading skills and their reading stamina over time.
Sometimes students anticipate where we're going. Oh, they're going to give us another short reading. Oh, we're going to have another reading that we have to complete. So one of the things that we also like to do is to kind of mix up where we think the students think we're going. And in this case, one way that we do that is to get students to think about the location, something that they saw in the initial images. And you all picked up on it. Some of you ask about, what about the location? What does location have to do with this? That is something that many of our students do not. In fact, they do what most of us do in a text when we don't know what to do with the information, and that's skip it. And unfortunately, many of our students, even ones who aren't struggling readers, simply ignore information that they don't have any schema for. So here is a good opportunity to take students back to the images and ask them to consider, what does location have to do with these images and with the text that they've already read? So let's look again at those labels and location. And we're not going to put up another chat box here, but if you want to share thoughts as we're going, feel free to drop it into the regular chat. So what does location have to do with these particular things? We might ask students to struggle with that question for a while. We might ask them to draft a quick write and come up with some ideas and pose some hypotheses. Or we might go ahead and show them a map. And so that's what we're going to do next. In the next slide is we've highlighted where those images are labeled. And the students haven't asked to see a map, or they haven't looked at a map. This is especially where we want to take them next. We've got this map to consider. And then we ask students again, after you see this image, does that change your hypothesis? Does that give you any additional evidence? Does it give you any additional questions? This allows us to, definitely to explore geographical setting and its implications as well. We've got one last reading, and in this reading, we're going to try and answer what location might have done. So we're going to try and explore that reading, or that map, through this reading. So our specific questions, what can you infer about how these people died? And what evidence supports your inference, are our compelling questions. But now, in this particular reading, we're going to build towards that compelling question by looking at, what does location have to do with this? So let's show you the last reading now, and we'll give you a few moments to read. So, according to this reading, then, why does location matter? Well, before we answer that directly, it's good to keep in mind that certainly this is an important link to Dimension 2, the applying disciplinary tools and concepts, and specifically supporting geographic thinking. This text gives us a sense of how widespread belief in vampires was during the Middle Ages in Europe. Hopefully, it also leads to additional questions. Was this belief just in Europe? Was it going on in Europe? What was going on in Europe that the belief was in multiple places? The last paragraph in this text gives us a hint about the Middle Ages, but this might take us to look more deeply at the Middle Ages, the Black Death, and the interaction of physical events, such as disease, and belief systems. We might also consider other locales following widespread disease or devastation, and think about how popular belief was shaped, not just in this particular time and location, but in other times and locations. So Tina, would you talk us through the way that we've used the series of 3 short texts, as well as the images and a map, to scaffold the readers?
Right, I want to go back and draw your attention to noticing some of the subtleties of strategies that we used before I highlight a synopsis of what we've done with our text. If you notice, we use color to draw attention to. Color also to identify vocabulary, but color can also be a cue to connections that you might make with the images that we had chosen, or location, why it might relate to that. We, in particular, used a strategy we call text chunking. And this also it's slightly different from short text, because short text can be a complete text that is just a short version. Short text can be modified primary source text. You can take a text and you can shorten it rather than making it a short text. You can take it and break it apart into chunks, into smaller segments, to where you can go more deeply into these segments, so that you can explore and use close reading again, as I mentioned before, but you have the capacity to take the time to really examine the content of the text, looking very closely at the nuances of language or word choice, asking deeper questions that might help us explore. One of the strategies that Dixie alluded to is the ability to contextualize the information, what's going on in Europe and why place might matter, and how place helps us begin to cue into the importance of contextualization, and in even linking us to the possibility of, who are these authors? And that's not a question we asked earlier, but something that we need to go back and revisit text. And when we use smaller chunks of text, or we use short text, that allows us to take the time to teach those skills that are associated with discipline-specific ways of thinking, which is Dimension 2. When we think about the content domains, how do we model the types of inquiry that are associated with historical thinking, or that are associated with geographical thinking? Why would I begin to think about place? And while you ask those questions at the beginning, it's not necessarily a question that students would be cued into asking. I mean, even though location is identified on each of the images, it's not something they would draw their attention to. Another aspect is the importance of building students' efficacy and interest. As you work with smaller chunks of text, students are paced to where they're included within the analysis of the content that's associated with evidence that they're pulling from the text, because you're limiting the amount of information, so you're including students in the conversation as you analyze and work in an after reading analysis of the text. You could also help deepen their focus. And with the text chunking, you can utilize the process of gradual release of responsibility, where you may engage with them very closely in the first text chunk, but then you may let them work with a partner in the second phase, or independent, and then come back and work together in as a more supported and scaffolded way as students develop their ability to utilize their literacy skills as they're reading with text and become more confident in the use of those skills. Some of the goals that we like to highlight in how we use text chunks is to break up, as I said before, the text, so that we can deepen the questioning that students are asking, to deepen the inquiry, to get students to generate their questions rather than us asking those questions, or us determining the path in which we're going to explore text. Their willingness to approach text. The length of the text for a struggling reader can be an indicator of whether or not students will choose to approach a task or to avoid a task. So if they are going to want to choose to do the task, it has to be something that they feel that they have the ability to accomplish the reading of it. So shortened text or chunks of text make text more approachable, especially for struggling readers. And there's also the ability with text chunking to differentiate the text to accommodate students that might need additional reading supports. And this again supports, their success. The more success they have as readers, the more willing they'll become as readers to engage with text. And there's also the point that we've iterated, and that is interest, of building interest. And I already spoke about the need to gradually release responsibility as students develop those literacy skills so they can move into more complex texts and move to the level of what we expect at the Common Core literacy of 12th grade, of reading independence of those more difficult informational texts that social studies exposes students to.
Gradual release of responsibility has often been portrayed as a sequence of teacher modeling, doing a shared example, and students completing a task on their own, or I do it, we do it, you do it. By using text chunks, we can facilitate all three of those, and ideally we can facilitate that in a single class period if needed. Initial chunks of text can serve as material for the teacher to think aloud with, being the model. Successive chunks of text can be read in partners or small groups in order to facilitate comprehension of text and content, and final chunks of text can be read independently. This allows us to meet at least two dimensions of the C3. Dimension 1, the developing questions and planning inquiries, and Dimension 3, gathering evidence and evaluating sources. So we can take students through a complete arc of inquiry. Let me offer a caveat to this sequence, though. Gradual release of responsibility maybe could be labeled responsive release of responsibility. That is, we give students what they can handle. If we start this inquiry, and one student pointed out right away that each skeleton was in a different location in Europe, we might not take them through a modeling of how we read a specific text. Instead, they're ready for more independence, and they might even be ready to skip some text. So we want to be ready for that. Now, before we move on, let me ask you to respond to one more text box. Where would you go next to find evidence to address your questions? And what sources would you use to continue your inquiry into these vampires?
And I'm going to ask that you pull the text boxes back.
Thank you. Give me a minute. I believe they might be behind the presentation.
So Tina, chime in when those text boxes come up, and I'm just going to go ahead and start talking through the next part. In our example with students, we've looked at images, we've read 3 short texts, as well as considered why location matters. Where would we go next? Ideally, our next step is invitation. We could certainly tell students where to go next, but we need to at least pause long enough to invite them to wonder and to value those wonderings by letting them pursue the questions that they have. If we've asked them to continually update their wonderings and wonderings and wonderings, and then we don't pause and say, now where are you interested in going next? We really haven't valued what students have offered. So we might pose to students questions like, what question compels you to learn more? Or what historical events would create a culture of vampire folklore or hysteria even? And where would you go to learn more, to formalize an argument or to draw conclusions? Historians are really detectives searching for evidence to a mystery that can never completely be solved. Wouldn't this image be more enticing to a bored high school student? And one reason why thinking like a historian deserves a place in American classrooms is to help them think. History is an argument about what facts should or shouldn't mean, and even when historians are able to piece together the basic story of what happened, they rarely agree about what an event means or what caused it. Historians argue about the past's meaning and what it has to tell us in the present. In history, a persuasive opinion is one backed up by evidence. So with that in mind, we offer one more pair of texts that we won't ask you to read, but will refer to And this emphasizes that history is a mystery that is often full of controversy and that one that is continued to be argued.
And before we show you a couple sources that we might add, we wanted to pause and give you the opportunity just to think out loud about where you would go next to find evidence and a possible source that you might choose to use to continue your inquiry.
So we see internet resources. I'm curious if you have any specific ones in mind that you are thinking about. There, Britannica Online. Curious about the Catholic Encyclopedia, the zombie cultures of Haiti. And if students could come up with some of those ideas that they would be interested in, it would make a really rich discussion in bringing in multiple sources like that. So social studies offers a wide range of complex informational visual text. Social studies texts expose students to a variety of voices and genres. It's not challenging to find complex primary or secondary sources that align to any of the content, but just providing students with these complex texts isn't sufficient to improve students' literacy and scaffold them into those. The challenge really is how to help all students access and analyze these complex texts in order to provide effective document-based instruction and generate evidence of informed thinking. In our particular investigation, we've attempted to scaffold them into more challenging texts, beginning with images, moving to a series of short texts. This might not be needed in every class. What we show here is reference to even more complex texts, and these are available in the larger C3LC investigation, and that they offer opposing arguments about the image of the skull with the brick in its mouth, and some of you mentioned that in the discussion in chat. So again, we won't go through these specific texts because of time, but essentially the discovering archaeologist infers that the skeleton, the one that we showed you with the brick in its mouth, must have been believed to be a vampire. But a second archaeologist in the second text that you see listed here used the same information and offers an argument in response saying he's not convinced that the skeleton was believed to be a vampire. These two texts are in scientific journals. They offer a great deal of more complex text. They're longer, they're denser. Hopefully through discussion of the previous short text, we've given students some background knowledge and vocabulary, but still those texts are very challenging. In the first text by Nuzalise, it's in the Journal of Forensic Science, and we wouldn't want to take the entire piece all at once. So we might go back to a way that we help students break down a text, chunk the text so that they understand the claim. Then when we get to the responding commentary, the second one that you see listed here, we can do a close read to determine, first of all, what Barini's argument is, how he structures the text to scaffold that argument, and ultimately, we want students to draw their own conclusion based on these two competing texts. Reisman and Weinberg suggest steps to promote historical thinking. These are familiar to you. You've seen the Reading Like a Historian, where we do sourcing, contextualizing, close reading, using background knowledge, reading the silences, and corroborating. As a reminder, these sources tell us that students need to be taught to think like historians, not because they'll become professional historians, but precisely because they won't. So the goal that we have is to help prepare students to tolerate complexity, to adapt to new situations, and to resist just the first answer that comes to mind. What we've introduced, hopefully, is a model for how to motivate students to approach those texts, but also the thinking. So Tina's going to do a little bit of review of some of the ideas about text complexity to delve deeper into our thoughts about scaffolding.
The best predictor of college enrollment and success is not the type of question that students can answer, but the type of text that students are asked to read. Text complexity is the best predictor of college readiness. There's a reason why the appendices in the Common Core standards for ELA indicate the importance of not just what students can do in their literacy strategies, but what the type of text, the text they're actually asked to read. Students need to have opportunities to read complex text. There are ways of modifying the two texts that Dixie offered that would allow for differentiated shortened text that would still create a level of complexity for various types of readers. But when we think about text complexity, we have various decisions that we have to make. We have to consider the quantitative aspects of the text, which are word count, word length, the lexile levels, but we also must include the qualitative aspects of the text. The level of meaning that the text introduced. I mean, some of the short texts that Dixie and I have developed have high lexile levels just because of the complexity of the meaning and the depth of content that the students get exposed to in a short frame. There's also language conventions and knowledge demands. I mean, what context? I mean, some of you mentioned culture in your post, and there are cultural background experiences of students that they bring into the text, which brings us to another point that we have to consider is matching the reader to text. We have to consider the attributes of the readers, their motivation, their experiences, their background knowledge, their anchoring schema. We must also consider, and this is a point that's not right here, and that is the text itself. What is the purpose of the text? What's the complexity of the questions that are being asked? And how is questioning a generative process? And also just the structure. Is the structure of the task that we're creating inviting? Does it want students to choose to engage with text? Or does it create a barrier in which the reluctant reader is not going to want to read the text? And we cannot dismiss the significance of the role of social studies in text complexity, that we offer a wide range of informational and visual text. And that's why one of the reasons that social studies is lifted up as an importance of being a very significant subject area. You know, the fact that social studies and the social sciences, history and the social sciences are included within the ELA standards raises the significance of what we can offer that no other subject area can in the text that we can expose students to. Another strategy that we have shared, at least made connections to, Common Core Anchor Standard 1, close reading. It is a vital, and if we think about some of the correlations between Common Core and the C3 framework, this anchor standard is a considered vital literacy standard in the C3 framework. Students don't come to us knowing how to close read or being motivated to read. We have to teach them how to read. Another conversation that Dixie and I have been talking quite a bit about of late, and that is just because they can close read in ELA does not mean they have the capacity or the skill set to close read in the domain-specific or disciplinary ways of reading that we do within the social studies. Do they have a mindset to read for context? Do they have a mindset to read for searching for evidence as we expect within the C3 framework? So these are some steps that in the close reading process, some general questions that we ask, but it is not necessarily an exact sequence that we follow every single time. These are questions that we generally ask in the close reading process. What does the text say? How does the text work? Knowing the text structure, and also what does the text mean in the nuances within our specific discipline. We have to be able to teach students how to close read as a historian, a geographer, a political scientist, economist, the disciplinary ways of knowing that we tout within our field. There's another attribute that we are identifying, and that is how can we take apart what we know as expert readers and present it in a way that it is replicable by the novice learner or the novice reader, the novice reader of history or the novice reader of geography. This is a process that Vygotsky called de-fossilizing. The ability to separate the various skill sets that a novice would have to replicate, because how a novice seeks and looks for evidence is different from how we would. Just the fact that we indicated that many times students don't pay attention to location. You paid very close attention to location because you are social studies experts, and you have a mindset with which you look at text. Your students in your classroom will not necessarily have that capacity. So helping students break apart the text to look at not only what the text is doing in a close reading process, but also to thinking metacognitively as as a reader, what am I doing in each of these steps? And we do identify, the importance of close reading as a layered and stepped process where not only are we reading, and we take close reading not just to stay solely to the text, but we do it as a process of zooming in and out of the text, reading what the text is saying literally, but also what are the inferences that we can draw from those evidence, the evidence that we're using to formulate our claims that we're developing from these texts, and how we're going to be able to use that evidence later to formulate our conclusions. And what we've modeled for you is some additional strategies of disciplinary literacies and disciplinary ways of knowing. Again, something that really distinguishes and sets apart the C3 framework from that of the Common Core. How teachers can help their students engage in disciplinary inquiry is a process that we really have to think about and we have to transfer. Teaching a way of thinking requires mapping thinking, making thinking visible and replicable. We need to show students, and we need to defossilize for students how experts, disciplinary experts, think, how they know what they think, how they ask particular types of questions, but not just showing them or modeling for them the questions, leading them in the process of Dixie and I have done of beginning to ask those questions themselves and using the questions from the text to generate their interest. So we use questioning as a framework here. Questioning is a universal literacy strategy that goes across disciplines, but we also use questioning as a way to ask questions that are specific to the text, that are specific to the ways of knowing and the ways of thinking that are within our disciplines that define the social studies. Disciplinary questions always ask for multiple interpretations, evidence-informed inquiry. It keeps students close to text, but it also requires them to infer from those texts and to look beyond and across text. And also to develop the capacity to use text-based claims so that they're not making their assumptions based on opinion, and they're able to differentiate where their information comes from, not just from Hollywood-influenced vampire lore, but looking at what the text, what history might say about vampire myths. In closing, what we have used here too is a cycle of text-informed inquiry. It begins with texts that have intellectually stimulating purpose. We encourage the use of visual text first. And that we do this to make reading an active inquiry process, one that's cyclical, that's circulating, that is iterative and generative, that develops disciplinary thinking consciousness. And by disciplinary thinking consciousness, we're talking about the ability to recognize specific processes associated with each of the disciplines, which is a unique, again, attribute of the C3 framework. Well, as I'm thinking here and looking at my clock, I noticed that we have about a minute left of your time, and we really appreciate you taking time to be with us in this webinar. We have developed an investigation that is an extension of what we've done here that provides much more depth associated with each of the steps that we used within our model for inquiry, our cycle for text-informed inquiry. The C3LC groups will have access to those, and eventually I think that will be accessible on a larger scale. This webinar will also be archived for use in conjunction with the investigation that we've developed. To be respectful of your time, it is 7:30. I'm sure that I'll speak on behalf of Dixie. Again, thank you for your time, but we would also stay and welcome any questions that you might have. We would be more than willing to take time to do that, but we also acknowledge that you may need to part and go about your other expectations. I see that Anna has posted here for you links to the Literacy and Learning Exchange, which is a wonderful resource. I hope you're telling your colleagues about this resource sponsored by the Gates Foundation, but also in conjunction with the work that NCSS is doing to develop a broader national awareness and use of the C3 framework. And also to model and use. Oh, I'm sorry, I was reading a question from Anna. So Andrew asked if we have any specific recommendations about how we might use these techniques with economics education. I would contend that the process itself, Andrew, is replicable with economics. I mean, you would still have students engage and read text in economics. It would be something that you might want to have students read and to develop a knowledge associated with a particular concept that they might engage with, like, for instance, supply and demand before they move into perhaps the stock market game and some of the decisions. How would they read text that might help them in their purchase of stocks and their trading of stocks, which we would hope we would want them to do within the stock market game rather than to purchase initial holdings and holding on to those for the whole time. Yes, and I agree with you, Andrew. Yes, absolutely. And graphs and charts are visual sources. Absolutely. And you can use those again to begin to ask questions about what the data might be indicating, that you could follow up with text, a short text reading afterwards. One thing I didn't mention is if you did want additional resources, let's see if I can advance to the end. These are some resources we might direct you to.